A dog raised a baby gorilla. After 2 years, their reunion was unbelievable. There is a moment, if you are lucky enough to witness it, when an animal does something that has no name in any scientific textbook. Not a conditioned reflex, not a survival mechanism. Something older than language, older than species, older than the clean boundary we have drawn between the world of instinct and the world of love. This story begins in that moment. It begins with a German shepherd named Bo standing at the edge of a reinforced enclosure, pressing the flat of his nose against cold steel mesh and refusing, absolutely refusing, to move. The keepers at the Lero Primate Rehabilitation Center in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo had seen Bo behave this way before, though never quite like this. He had always been a calm animal, steady as a metronome, the kind of dog who moved through a noisy rehabilitation center the way a river moves through stone, around everything, wearing nothing down, leaving the world quieter in his wake. But on this morning in the early dry season, with the red dust hanging in the air like powdered rust, and the calls of 100 displaced primates rising into the canopy above, Bo was not calm. He was trembling, not with fear, with something far more complicated. Inside the enclosure, a young gorilla named Kessie sat with her back to the mesh, pressing her own body against it as if trying to merge with the steel, as if the barrier between her and whatever was on the other side of it was a wound she was trying to close. She was pressing so hard her dark fingers had turned pale at the tips. And she was making a sound that the senior keeper, a man named Francois, who had worked with great apes for over 20 years, said he had only ever heard once before, at the deathbed of a much older gorilla who had lost her troop to a snare-related injury. It was a sound, he said, that sat somewhere between a moan and a question. A sound that had no answer in the physical world. If you are watching this right now, wherever you are in the world, take a moment before we go on. Hit that like button below this video. It is such a small thing, but it is how this channel survives, and it is how stories like Bo and Kessie's find their way to people who need them. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we share stories like this every single week, and you do not want to miss a single one. And in the comments, tell us, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? We love knowing that this one story is landing simultaneously in 100 different cities, 100 different kinds of light. Now, let us go back to the beginning. The story of Bo and Kessie begins, as so many of the most improbable love stories do, in catastrophe. Kessie was 11 days old when she arrived at Wero. She came wrapped in a piece of burlap that smelled of smoke and something metallic, cradled against the chest of a conservation officer who had driven 6 hours across roads that were more suggestion than infrastructure to bring her to a place where she might live. Her mother had been killed. The manner of it too brutal for this narration, the cause of it too familiar, and in the chaos that followed, Kessie had been found clinging to what remained of her family with a grip that seemed physiologically impossible for something that weighed less than 2 kilograms. She was dehydrated. She had a small laceration along her left forearm. Her eyes, which in a healthy infant gorilla should carry a certain ancient liquid calm, were glazed with the specific flatness of profound shock. The veterinary team worked on her through the night, and by morning she was breathing more steadily, but she was refusing to eat. This is one of the cruelest paradoxes of infant primate rehabilitation. The very trauma that brings them to you creates a neurological state in which they cannot accept the help being offered. The body closes down. The immune system falters. The digestive system shuts like a fist. Without the smell of a mother's body, without the particular sound of a mother's heartbeat at 60 beats per minute, without the texture of a mother's chest hair, the infant gorilla loses something the formula cannot replace, and sometimes, despite every clinical intervention, they simply stop. The center had faced this before.
They had lost infants before, and Francois, who had seen enough small funerals to know when one was coming, made a decision born less from protocol than from desperate intuition. He brought Bo in. Bo was not a therapy dog in any officially certified sense. He was technically the center's security animal, a 7-year-old German shepherd of extraordinary temperament who had been trained for perimeter work but who had over the years quietly developed a second vocation. He was the creature who appeared, seemingly unbidden, at the bedside of the
recently arrived. He had done it with a juvenile chimpanzee the previous rainy season. He had done it with a pair of bonobos before that. Nobody had asked him to. Nobody had trained him to. He simply arrived, lay down outside whatever enclosure held the new patient, and breathed. The first time Bo lay outside Kessie's recovery crate, she was still turned away from the world. But within 40 minutes, the monitoring equipment registered something the vets had not seen since her arrival. Her heart rate dropped. Not dangerously. The opposite, it dropped from a stress elevated 120 beats per minute towards something approaching normal. By the 3rd hour, she had turned to face the wire. By the 6th hour, she had crawled to within arm's reach of Bo's warm flank, and her fingers, those pale-tipped, impossibly strong fingers, were threaded into his fur. Over the weeks that followed, a bond formed that defied every boundary the center had established between dogs and great apes. Under careful supervised conditions, with staff present at all times, and with the physical interaction limited to what Kessie could initiate, Bo became something the medical team struggled to categorize. He was not a mother. He was not a surrogate of any primate kind. He was something the language of attachment science had not quite caught up with, a cross-species anchor, a living, breathing, warm-bodied reason to stay. Kessie began eating the day after Bo first lay beside her crate. She gained weight in the 2nd week, 13% body mass, a recovery rate that the veterinary staff described in their notes as clinically remarkable, and described to each other after hours in far less clinical terms. She played, which is the gorilla equivalent of a declaration, "I intend to survive." She wrestled Bo's thick tail. She studied his ears with the intense tactile curiosity of a primate for whom hands are also a form of intelligence. And Bo, this steady, patient, rust and black animal who had never once in 7 years shown anything but professional composure, allowed all of it, more than allowed. He participated. He would roll to expose his belly for her inspection. He would mirror her posture when she sat up straight. He would rest his chin on the ground near her when she slept, so that his exhalations moved the tiny hairs at the back of her neck in a rhythm that kept her nervous system from flooding with cortisol. Francois called it, in his written report to the Conservation Board, a mutual regulation of affect, which is the scientific way of saying they were keeping each other's hearts in time. For 2 years, this was the center of Kessie's world. Through the wet seasons when the forest outside turned into a green so saturated it looked painted. Through the dry seasons when the air tasted of chalk and distance. Through the slow work of learning to be a gorilla, how to climb, how to forage, how to read the social signals of her species. Bo was the constant, the warm weight she returned to, the smell she searched for when something frightened her. He was her true north. And then the protocol that every rehabilitation center must follow asserted itself. At 2 years of age, Kessie was ready to begin the gradual integration process that would eventually return her to a semi-wild group. It is the purpose of everything they do at Wero to make themselves unnecessary, to work toward the moment when the animal in their care no longer needs them. But the process required, first, a period of separation. Kessie needed to fully bond with her conspecific group. She needed to learn to sleep and eat and navigate her fear without the specific comfort of Bo's presence. And Bo needed to return to his own rhythms, his own species, his own life. The separation was not abrupt. It was managed with every clinical grace the team possessed. But what happened over the days that followed it was not something any protocol had prepared them for. Kessie stopped eating again. Not completely. She was not an infant anymore, and her body had more reserves, more stubbornness, but her intake dropped by 40%, and she began exhibiting what the primatologists on staff recognized as morning behavior, reduced activity, repetitive self-soothing gestures, prolonged. Staring toward the part of the compound where she associated Bo's presence, she was not sick, her blood work was clean, her temperature was normal, the absence had a weight, and she was carrying it. Meanwhile, on the other side of the compound, Bo had stopped sleeping through the night. He paced. He sought out the keepers who most often accompanied Kessie. He sat at the edge of her visual territory and waited with a patience that was almost unbearable to witness, the patience of a creature who has no way to ask the question and cannot stop asking it. The senior veterinarian, a woman named Dr. Aline, who had spent a decade studying ape cognition before coming to Luiro, convened a staff meeting. She put 2 pieces of data on the table, Kessie's caloric intake and a heart rate graph showing Bo's nighttime measurements, which had elevated by an average of 18 beats per minute since the separation. "They are grieving each other," she said. "I don't have a clinical category for it, but I know what I'm looking at. The rehabilitation protocols were not designed for this. The literature on great ape recovery did not cover what happens when the primary attachment figure is a different species entirely. There was no peer-reviewed paper to consult. There was only what Dr. Aline knew about the nervous system, and what Francois knew about broken hearts, and what Bo was telling them every single night with his sleepless pacing. Something is missing, and I know where it is." The decision, when they made it, was careful and conditional and supervised, and, in the end, one of the most quietly radical acts of veterinary compassion in the center's history. They would allow a reunion, controlled, brief, monitored in real time on every metric that mattered, and they would watch what happened. The morning of the reunion, the air over the compound carried the heavy, humid promise of rain. The light was the particular gold of early morning in that part of the Congo, a light that turns everything it touches slightly sacred. Bo was brought to the outer boundary of Kessie's integration enclosure on a lead, which was protocol. He was calm in the way that rivers are calm, in motion, utterly purposeful. And when Kessie, across 30 feet of carefully managed ground, lifted her head and found the smell that had been the center of her world for 2 years, that specific warm animal smell of dog and patience and love without language, she did something no one on the staff was fully prepared for. She came toward him at a run. Not the exploratory lope of a curious gorilla, a run. The full-bodied commitment of a creature moving toward the thing it knows, the way a ship knows, where home is not by instruction, but by the pull of it. She pressed herself against the mesh and reached for him, and Bo, without any hesitation at all, without any signal from the handlers, who were now very quietly crying, pressed back. And then they were still. Both of them. Beau's head was against her chest, and her arms were around his neck as far as the mesh would allow, and they were breathing. Dr. Aline noted this specifically in the report she filed that afternoon. They were breathing in the same rhythm. In for 3 counts. Out for 5. The perfect, unconscious synchronization of 2 nervous systems that recognized each other as safe. Kessie's heart rate, as measured by the remote biometric collar she wore, dropped 14 beats per minute in the 40 seconds following contact. Beau's rate, measured by the sensor embedded in his collar, dropped 11. They regulated each other. They always had. In the weeks that followed, the reunion changed both animals. Kessie's appetite returned to 103% of her previous intake, a small statistical detail that contains an ocean of meaning. She integrated more fluidly with her conspecific group. She played more. She slept longer. Beau, for the first time since the separation, was observed sleeping through the night on 3 consecutive nights, something the keepers documented with the kind of reverence usually reserved for much larger events. They were not cured of each other. That was never the goal and never could be. But they had been given what both needed most, the knowledge that the bond still existed, that the other was still in the world. That love, even across species, even across the clinical walls of protocol, does not simply dissolve because it is inconvenient. What this story teaches us is both simple and almost impossible to fully absorb. It teaches us that the category of animal emotion is not a cage we have built for convenience. It is a description of something real, something measurable, something that expresses itself in heart rates and food intake and the specific sound a gorilla makes when she is looking for the one living. Thing that makes her feel safe. It teaches us that empathy is not a human invention. It is older than us. It predates our species by enough millions of years to make our ownership of the concept faintly absurd. And it teaches us, perhaps most importantly, most tenderly, that a bond formed in crisis carries its own kind of permanence. That what Beau gave Kessie in those first 6 hours, when she was 100 grams of trauma and fading will, was not just warmth. It was proof that the world contained one living thing that chose her, that laid its weight beside her and said, in the only language that mattered, I am here. I am not leaving. You are not alone. We do not have a scientific term for what that is. We do not need one. If this story moved something in you, and we believe it did, because that is what true things do, please share it. Not just because it helps this channel, though it does, genuinely, deeply. Share it, because there are people in your life who need to hear that cross-species bonds exist, that the circle of empathy is wider than we thought, that love does not require a shared language or a shared genome or a shared understanding of what it costs. Share it because Kessie and Beau did something remarkable, and they did it without knowing anyone was watching, which is the purest kind of remarkable there is. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories from the edge of what we think we know about the animal world. Like this video if it reminded you that the world is more tender than the news suggests. And then, in the comments, tell us this. Have you ever witnessed an animal displaying what you could only call intuition? An animal that seemed to know something it had no earthly business knowing. We read every comment. We are always looking for the next story. And sometimes the next story finds us first.